The cabin sat deep in the woods, far off any real roads or trails. I had found it by chance one summer, searching for a place to get away from everything. No internet, no phone signal, just the thick forest and the smell of pine and wet earth. It was old, rough-hewn logs stacked tight, with a stone chimney on one side and windows that looked out into a sea of green. I liked the isolation. I liked the silence. For a few days, it felt like I had stepped into another world, one where time didn't rush and the noise of people didn't reach. The first day, I drove as far as the old dirt road would take me, then parked and walked the rest of the way through the trees. The path was narrow and overgrown in parts. Moss covered the rocks and roots snaked across the trail like veins. The air was thick with humidity, even though it was early morning. I could hear birds somewhere up high, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. When I saw the cabin through the trees, the sunlight broke through the canopy in shafts that lit the dust floating in the air. It smelled like damp wood and something faintly sweet, wildflowers maybe, or pine resin. I spent that first day unpacking and cleaning out the cabin. It had been empty for years, and the dust lay thick on the furniture. The floor creaked underfoot, and some of the boards near the back door looked rotten. I made a fire in the hearth to chase away the chill and cooked a simple dinner on an old camping stove I'd brought. The night fell early, and without any screens or lights from outside, the darkness was absolute. I lay awake, listening to the night sounds: crickets, frogs, the wind brushing through the branches. By the second day, I was getting comfortable. I brought water from the nearby stream and started to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, with tall hardwoods and thick underbrush. The ground was soft underfoot, and every now and then, I would step on a patch of moss that felt almost like a sponge. I noticed animal tracks near the stream: deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote. I had packed a small hunting knife and a flashlight, but there was no real danger, I thought. Just nature doing what it always did. On the third day, I started to notice things that unsettled me. First, it was small stuff. A rock that had been by the cabin door moved a few feet away. A stick that had been lying on the porch vanished. I thought maybe I had misplaced it or that wind had knocked it over. But then I found small piles of dirt disturbed near the edge of the clearing. Something had been digging there, though I couldn't see any obvious holes. That night, the sounds in the forest changed. Instead of the usual night chorus, there were more irregular noises. Snapping twigs, rustling bushes, something heavy moving through the undergrowth. I kept the fire burning long, sitting close to it with my knife on my lap. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the clearing, and I felt more alone than before. The next morning, I found the cabin door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it tightly before bed. Inside, nothing was disturbed, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. I checked all the windows and made sure they were locked. The woods around the cabin felt too quiet, like they were holding their breath. That day, I decided to explore farther. I packed a small bag with water, some food, and my knife. I followed a faint trail that led uphill, deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, and the light dimmed beneath the heavy canopy. After about an hour, I found a clearing with an old, rusted-out car half buried in leaves and vines. It looked like it had been there for decades. The metal was corroded, and the tires were gone, swallowed by the earth. I searched around the car but didn't find anything useful. As I turned to head back, I thought I heard voices, low murmurs carried by the wind. But when I stopped and listened, the forest was silent again. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and tried to relax. But the feeling of unease was growing. I noticed the piles of disturbed earth again, closer to the cabin this time. Someone or something had been digging near the back wall. That night, the noises started again, louder and closer. There was a scraping sound on the roof, soft but deliberate. Something heavy moving outside, pacing around the cabin. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and crept to the window, shining the light into the dark woods. I saw nothing, but the feeling of eyes staring at me from the shadows was overwhelming. I stayed awake all night, the knife clenched in my hand. The next morning, I found deep claw marks on the door frame. The wood was splintered and gouged as if something with long nails had been trying to get in. I realized then that I was not alone in these woods. Something was out there watching, testing me. The thought filled me with cold dread. Over the next days, I tried to keep busy, but I never stopped feeling watched. The piles of dug earth multiplied, and I found footprints, large, heavy, with thick toes and claws around the cabin. Not any animal I knew. The prints led into the woods, but never far from the cabin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed fresh marks on the roof. Deep scratches and small dents, like something was jumping or climbing on top. I didn't know what it was, but it was big and strong. I stayed inside, barricading the door with furniture. That night was the worst. The noises outside were relentless. Scratches, thumps, and heavy breathing just beyond the walls. I could hear something moving around, circling the cabin. The fear was suffocating. I stayed awake, waiting for dawn, my knife ready but knowing it wouldn't be enough. When morning finally came, the noises stopped. I dared to step outside and found the ground around the cabin churned up, the piles of dirt freshly dug. The claw marks on the door and walls were deeper and more numerous. I packed what I could, deciding I wouldn't stay another night. As I walked back along the path, I felt eyes on me all the way. Every crack of a twig made me jump. When I finally reached my car at the edge of the dirt road, I was shaking, soaked in sweat despite the cold. I looked back at the dark line of trees, the cabin swallowed by the forest, and I knew I would never go back. What I don't understand is what it was that lived in those woods. Something big, intelligent maybe, and definitely dangerous. I never saw it clearly, but the marks and sounds were real, and they left no doubt. The cabin, my refuge, became a trap, and I escaped by luck. Now, back in the city, the memory still haunts me. The silence, the eyes in the dark, the claw marks on the old wood. I know the forest keeps its secrets, and some things are better left alone. I wanted peace in those woods, but what I found was something primal and terrifying, real and close enough to touch. I'm done chasing the quiet now. Some places aren't meant for us, and some fears don't fade with the daylight. The sun was low, just starting to bleed its last orange streaks across the sky, when I pulled up to the cabin. It sat deep in the woods, the kind of place that doesn't show up on most maps, tucked away behind thick pine trees and a muddy, winding dirt road that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, the way it always does before night falls in the forest. I was alone. My phone had barely any signal, which I thought was perfect. I needed to get away from the noise of everything for a few days. The cabin was rough but solid. Weathered wooden logs stacked tightly, a stone chimney with thin smoke still curling from it. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped out, the fading light casting long shadows across the clearing. I'd brought just the essentials: food, water, a flashlight, and a small camping stove. No one else was coming, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the scent of old wood mixed with years of dust and something faintly metallic I couldn't place. The floorboards groaned underfoot. The windows were grimy and smudged from outside dirt and the inside moisture. There was a small kitchen area, a table with a few chipped mugs, a cast iron skillet on the stove. On the walls hung some faded photographs, mostly of trees and wildlife, nothing personal. The cabin had been left alone for a while, maybe months, but it felt safe enough. I set down my backpack and lit a small fire in the stone hearth, carefully stacking dry sticks and kindling I found scattered on the floor. The flame caught quickly and flickered against the walls, casting a warm glow that pushed back the gathering dark outside. I unpacked my food, a couple of cans of beans, a loaf of bread, some jerky, and ate quietly, the silence wrapping around me like a thick blanket. Night crept in fast. Outside, the forest became a deep black, almost alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. I stepped outside to get some fresh air, the ground cold and damp beneath my boots. The stars were sharp and clear, brighter than I'd seen in the city for years. I thought about how few people ever came this far, how easy it was to disappear here. As I went back inside, I noticed a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, heart picking up. It wasn't the usual night sounds. No animal I knew made that slow, deliberate scrape. The forest held its breath with me for a moment before the noise stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else came. Maybe it was just a branch or a deer brushing against a tree. I tried to shake off the unease and went to bed early, curling up under the thin blanket on the creaky old mattress. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine, and outside, the wind whispered through the trees. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound seemed louder. The creak of wood settling, the soft patter of something moving outside. Around midnight, I woke up to a sharp thud somewhere near the back of the cabin. My skin prickled, and I lay still, listening. The thud was followed by a soft scratching sound, like fingernails or claws against wood. Came from outside, right where the kitchen window was. My heart was pounding. I wanted to tell myself it was a raccoon or some small animal, but the sound felt deliberate, slow, methodical. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly got out of bed, trying not to make noise on the floor. The beam cut through the dark as I moved to the window. Outside, nothing was there, just the black trees and the shifting shadows. But the ground near the window was disturbed. The dirt and leaves were scraped away in a patch, as if someone or something had been digging or trying to get in. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling slightly. I checked the other windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. The old cabin had sturdy locks, but the windows weren't made to keep out a determined intruder. The thought that someone could have been outside, watching me, digging at my shelter, made my skin crawl. I went back to bed, this time with the flashlight on the floor beside me, the beam pointing at the ceiling. Every noise made me jump. The wind sounded different now, almost like it carried whispers, but maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. The next morning, the sun rose cold and gray, cutting weak light through the mist that hung low over the trees. I stayed inside most of the day, feeling watched, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there in the woods, just beyond sight. I tried to keep busy, cleaning up the cabin, making a fire, rationing my food. But every time I looked out a window, I caught movement in the trees, shadows shifting too fast to be animals, or just shapes that seemed to linger. The forest was too quiet too. No birds, no animals moving around. Just a heavy stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with a knife in my hand, the silence pressing in on me. Then, the sound started again. Slow footsteps circling the cabin, barely making noise on the soft earth. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs, the faint scrape of something being dragged. The footsteps stopped suddenly near the front door. My whole body tensed. I didn't move, not even to breathe. After what felt like hours, the noises moved away, retreating into the darkness. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to close my eyes. When the sun finally rose, weak and pale, I stepped outside with a plan to leave. I had brought a car with me, parked at the end of the dirt road, and I intended to get in and drive far away. But the forest looked different in the daylight, denser, darker, almost hostile. As I walked toward the path, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt, large, heavy boots that didn't belong to me, circling the cabin, stopping near every window and door. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soil from the night before. I followed the trail back toward the road, my heart pounding. The footprints weren't alone. Alongside them were other marks, scratches, gouges in the bark of trees, and strange symbols carved roughly into the wood of nearby trunks. I didn't recognize the symbols, but they weren't random. Someone had taken the time to make them. The road was empty when I reached it, but the quiet was suffocating. No cars passed, no birds chirped, no breeze stirred the leaves. I hurried to my car, threw my bag in the back, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of a figure standing just inside the tree line, watching me. Didn't move, didn't blink. Just stood there, solid and still, wearing dark clothes that blended into the forest shadows. I didn't wait. I put the car into gear and slammed on the gas, tires spinning on the dirt. The figure didn't chase me, but the feeling of being hunted stuck with me like a weight on my chest. On the drive back to civilization, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, expecting to see that figure again. But the woods swallowed the cabin and its secrets behind me, and the normal sounds of the highway slowly returned. When I finally reached a gas station near town, I pulled in and locked the doors, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I called the local sheriff and told them about the cabin, the footprints, the symbols. They said they'd send someone out, but the area was known for squatters, hunters, and drifters. Nothing they hadn't dealt with before. I never went back. I kept the memories buried deep, but the feeling never left me. The feeling that out there, deep in the woods, someone had been watching, waiting for me to come. Not a ghost or some fairy tale creature, just a person. A real person. And the realest fear I had was knowing that when people like that are out there, in the middle of nowhere, and they don't want to be found, you have nowhere to run. The cabin was never safe, and I never will be completely sure what I saw that night. But I know this. Sometimes the scariest thing is knowing that someone else is out there, and they're closer than you think. Real, human, dangerous. Not a story to tell, but something that stays with you long after the fire dies out. The sun was just starting to dip below the thick line of trees when I finally pulled up to the cabin. The road leading there was little more than a dirt track, narrow and rough, winding deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone before on my own. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, a break from the noise and stress of city life. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, somewhere I could sit quietly and read, maybe do some fishing in the nearby lake, and just disconnect from everything for a while. The cabin itself was older but sturdy. It was made from dark wood logs, worn smooth from years of weather, with a small porch that looked out onto a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The windows were dusty and clouded, but I could tell from the outside that it was empty. The only sounds were the wind in the branches and the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing and unloaded my bags. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and damp earth. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a metal sink with no running water, a cot with a thin mattress, and a rickety table. The place was basic but enough. No electricity, no phone signal, nothing but the quiet wilderness. I set my things down and went outside to gather firewood. The dry branches snapped underfoot as I walked through the forest near the cabin. I stacked the wood near the porch and started a small fire in the stove to warm the place up before nightfall. The air was cooling fast now, and a thin mist began to creep through the trees. Once the fire was burning, I sat in a wooden chair on the porch and looked out across the clearing. The forest was dense, and the shadows grew longer. There was a calmness here, but also a weight, a feeling of being watched that I couldn't quite shake. I told myself it was just the wilderness, the unknown, playing tricks on my mind. I wasn't the first person to be out here alone. As night fell, the sounds of the forest changed. The birds quieted, replaced by the soft chirping of crickets and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls. I settled onto the cot with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window, to the dark forest outside. At some point, I heard it, a faint snapping of twigs coming from the edge of the clearing. I froze, listening. The sound was subtle but clear. Someone or something was moving through the underbrush. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, animals that lived in these woods. But the sound came again, a little closer this time, and then stopped. I sat quietly for a long time, waiting, eyes fixed on the darkened window. Nothing moved. The forest was still again. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was safe inside, that the cabin was solid, and the fire would keep most animals away. but sleep was hard to come by. Every noise made me jump. The wind scraping branches against the roof, the distant call of a bird, even the shifting of the firewood outside. I kept imagining footsteps around the cabin, shadows lurking just beyond the porch light. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something tapping on the window. Slow, deliberate knocks like someone rapping with their fingers. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up, eyes wide, staring at the window, but the darkness outside swallowed any shape or figure. I held my breath and waited. The knocking stopped, and silence returned, thick and heavy. My mind raced with every possible explanation. Someone playing a prank? A hunter? Or something worse? I didn't sleep much after that. The night dragged on in long minutes and hours, each one heavier than the last. At dawn, I decided to leave. The thought of staying another night was unbearable. I packed quickly and stepped outside. The morning air was cold and fresh, but the forest felt different in the daylight. The clearing was quiet, peaceful again, like nothing had happened. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A set of footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. They were large and deep, made by boots. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared back into the woods. That was when I realized I wasn't alone here last night. Someone had been watching me, maybe even waiting for me to arrive. I didn't look back as I drove away. The woods stayed silent behind me, but I could still feel those eyes, watching, waiting. The city lights felt like a blessing when I got back. The safety of people, noise, and life. I never went back to that cabin. I had been planning this trip for months, maybe too long. I needed to get away from everything: work, people, noise. The city was a pressure cooker, and the only way I could breathe was to find some real silence. I'd found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, off a gravel road that ended miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no internet, no electricity. Just me and the forest. The day I arrived, the sun was already dipping low, casting a thick, warm light over the pine trees. The cabin looked rough but solid. A squat little wooden building, weathered by years of cold winters and summer storms. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall, dense forest that stretched out in every direction. There was a small stack of firewood leaning against the porch and a rusty metal bucket nearby. I unloaded my gear: sleeping bag, canned food, water bottles, a small camping stove, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, fresh but sharp in a way that made my chest tighten a bit. I always thought the forest would feel peaceful, but standing there alone, it felt different. Larger, more alive than I expected. I spent the first hour just walking the clearing, taking in the silence. No cars, no planes, not even birds chirping much. That quietness pressed on me. I kept my flashlight handy as the light faded fast, and when night came, the woods became a black wall all around the cabin. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a battered table with 2 chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. No running water, no bathroom, just an outhouse out back. I lit the stove using some matches I brought, the dry wood snapping and crackling as the room filled with a faint smoky warmth. I ate cold beans and crackers for dinner, washed down with water from a plastic jug. The darkness outside felt heavy, and I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see movement. But nothing came, just the shadows of branches moving in the wind. After a while, I lay down on the bed, listening to the occasional creaks of the cabin settling and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I felt my eyes grow heavy and eventually drifted off. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. It was quiet at first, but then I noticed a faint noise from outside, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves and twigs. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I froze, my heart pounding in the dark room. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon maybe, but the steps were too heavy and uneven, like someone walking carefully but without hurry. My mind raced. Who else would be out here at this hour? I thought about the remote location and how unlikely it was anyone else was nearby, but the sound didn't lie. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and clicked it on. The beam cut through the window and lit up the small clearing in front of the cabin. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the noise stopped. I held my breath. The woods returned to silence. My pulse slowed, but the unease stayed. I moved quietly to the door and cracked it open just enough to peer out. The moon was low but bright, washing the trees in pale silver. The ground was undisturbed except for a few prints in the dirt leading around the back of the cabin. I stepped outside, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The night air was cold and smelled faintly of wet earth and moss. I scanned the treeline but saw nothing. No movement, no shapes, just the thick black shadows of the woods. Still, the footprints were there. I crouched down and examined them. They were large, maybe size 12 or 13 boots, deep impressions in the soft dirt. They led from the forest edge, past the cabin, then around the back, disappearing into the trees again. I thought about calling for help, but my phone was useless here. No signal at all. I had brought a small hunting knife, just in case, and I tucked it into my belt. I closed the door and locked it, then settled back inside, bolting the old wooden latch. The next day, I tried to shake off the night's fears. The forest in daylight was different, warm, inviting even. I took a long walk to explore the area, following a narrow path that wound between the trees. The air was fresh, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the silence. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. Who could have been out here? I found no other signs, no campsites, no trash, no other cabins or buildings. It felt like I was alone, except for whoever had come by last night. Back at the cabin, I prepared a fire and boiled water for coffee on the wood stove. I noticed the door latch looked a little off, like it had been jiggled. Maybe the wind, maybe something else. As the sun dipped again, I settled in for another night. I made sure to barricade the door well, piling some heavy firewood in front of it just in case. That night, the noises started earlier. At first, it was the rustling of animals moving through the underbrush, but then came other sounds. Snapping branches, footsteps circling the clearing. I heard something scraping along the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, ready to face whatever it was. The beam of light caught a shadow moving near the back porch. I shined the light directly, but the figure melted into the darkness. I stayed alert until dawn, but no more sounds came. The next morning, I found marks on the cabin's wood, deep scratches, like claws or a heavy tool scraping the wall. I felt a cold dread that I couldn't explain. I packed up most of my gear, thinking I might leave early. But something held me there, like I had to see it through. That afternoon, I decided to set up a makeshift alarm system, tying some empty cans to strings around the perimeter, hoping to hear if someone tried to approach again. I kept watch, moving between the cabin and the clearing, flashlight close at hand. That night was the worst. The noises came again, louder and more aggressive. The footsteps were all around, circling the cabin in a pattern, pausing at each can. Every time one of the cans clanged against the string, my heart jumped. Then I heard heavy breathing, close enough to feel through the walls. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife tightly, scanning every window and door frame. Suddenly, a loud thud shook the cabin. Something hit the door with full force. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. More pounding followed. Hits, slams, desperate and angry. I realized whoever or whatever was outside was trying to break in. I ran to the stove, grabbed the poker tool, an old iron rod, and held it up like a weapon. The door shook again and again, and I shouted as loud as I could, hoping to scare it off, but the banging didn't stop. Then, without warning, silence fell. I stood there listening, waiting. Nothing moved. I slowly opened the door, peered outside. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no figure, no sign of anything or anyone. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. To first light, I packed everything. I grabbed my stuff, doused the fire, and locked the door tight. As I walked down the gravel road, the sun rising behind me, I kept looking over my shoulder. I never found out what had been out there. There was no one in the nearby town who reported any strange visitors. The police said it was probably just animals or kids playing pranks. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And I'm certain that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop until it got inside. Now, every time I hear footsteps behind me, or someone moving in the dark, my skin crawls. The forest is not as peaceful as it looks. I never went back. The forest was thick and silent when I first arrived at the cabin. I had chosen the place at random, searching online for somewhere off the grid to spend a week alone, away from the noise of the city, away from the constant hum of daily life. The pictures showed a small, weathered wooden cabin nestled in the middle of dense woods, a thin trail leading to it from a barely visible dirt road. No electricity, no cell service, just the promise of isolation and quiet. It was exactly what I wanted. I pulled up to the parking spot near the trailhead in my old car, packed with supplies for the week. Backpacks, canned food, water, a small propane stove, matches, a good knife, and the usual camping gear. I locked the car and started down the trail, my boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs scattered across the ground. The air was sharp and cool, smelling of pine and earth. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in tighter around me, their branches like fingers stretching out over the path, blotting out the sunlight in patches. It was late afternoon when I reached the cabin. It looked even more worn up close. Faded wood planks, a sagging roof with a few shingles missing, a porch with creaky boards. But it was solid, and I liked that. There was a stack of firewood piled beside the porch and a rusted metal chimney poking out from the roof. The windows were grimy, but I could see the interior was simple. A small table, a chair, a wood stove, and a single bed frame with a thin mattress. I set my packs down and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately, but it was familiar and somehow comforting. I made a quick sweep of the place, checked the stove and fireplace, found the box of matches, and set my things down. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The first night was quiet except for the usual sounds of the forest. Distant hoots of owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the creak of trees swaying in the breeze. I made a fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal on my propane burner, the orange flames crackling and casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. I lay on the mattress afterward, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the silence press in. It was exactly the kind of peaceful solitude I had been looking for. The next day, I spent hours exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick but beautiful. Tall pines, clusters of birch and maple, moss-covered rocks, and patches of wildflowers. I found a small creek a short walk from the cabin, the water clear and cold. I filled my water bottles and took a moment to rest on a fallen log, enjoying the sun filtering through the leaves. That afternoon, I gathered some more firewood and tidied the cabin, sweeping the floor and checking the supplies I had brought. I noticed the door to the cellar under the cabin was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that when I arrived. The wooden hatch was old and warped, but the latch had been undone. My first thought was that maybe the previous occupant had left it that way, or the wind had shifted it open. Curious, I grabbed my flashlight and descended the narrow wooden steps. The cellar was dark and damp, smelling of mold and earth. I swept the light around the walls and floor, finding only some old, empty crates and a few rusty tools. Nothing out of place, no signs of animals or people. Still, the sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I closed the hatch and secured it tightly. That evening, as I sat near the stove again, I thought I heard footsteps outside. Not the soft padding of an animal, but heavier, slower steps on the dry leaves. I stood up quickly and moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Nothing moved. No lights, no shapes, just the dense trees standing still. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The forest had a way of playing tricks on you when you were alone. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept hearing noises at odd times. A twig snapping nearby, the faint scrape of something dragging across the ground, low murmurs carried by the wind that I couldn't make out. Sometimes, I would catch glimpses of shadows shifting just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was normal. Wild animals, maybe a hunter passing through, or just the forest settling at night. One afternoon, I was gathering water from the creek when I found something strange. A pair of footprints pressed into the soft mud by the bank. They were human, big and heavy, with deep impressions that showed the shape of a thick-soled boot. What unsettled me was that the prints seemed fresh, maybe from that morning. I traced them with my finger, noticing how they led away from the creek and deeper into the woods, toward the cabin. That night, I double-checked the locks on the cabin door and windows. I stacked firewood near the entrance to make noise if anyone tried to come close. I stayed up late, listening. The next morning, I found the door to the cellar open again. The latch had been undone, and this time, there were muddy footprints leading from the cellar steps to the door. Someone had been inside the cabin while I was asleep. My heart hammered in my chest. The realization hit me hard. I was not alone. I thought about leaving right then, packing everything into my car and driving away, but something held me back. I wasn't sure what exactly, maybe stubbornness or the need to prove I could handle this. I spent the next day staying mostly inside, keeping the windows covered and the door locked tight. I kept the fire burning and my knife close. When night came, the forest noises seemed louder than ever, almost like a low growl surrounding the cabin. Around midnight, I heard the door creak open. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was outside, standing just beyond the porch, probably watching. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window. The beam caught on a figure crouching by the firewood stack. A man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and a hat pulled low. I couldn't see his face clearly. He froze for a moment, then disappeared into the shadows. I debated what to do, but decided not to call for help. There was no cell service, and I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me. Besides, the man hadn't actually tried to come inside yet. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the stove, waiting for the sun. Morning came slowly. I was exhausted, but nothing else happened during the day. I considered leaving again, but figured if I hurried, I might attract attention. That afternoon, I explored the perimeter of the property, looking for signs of how this man could be moving in and out without me seeing him. I found several makeshift trails, small paths beaten down through the underbrush that led from the main road to the cabin. I realized that whoever this was had been watching me for days, coming close enough to the cabin to unlock the cellar and leave prints, but never directly confronting me. That night, I slept with the knife under my pillow and the fire still burning low. The feeling of dread was thick in the air. I was a long way from help, and I didn't know what this man wanted or if he planned to come back. At dawn, I made a decision. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, some food, my knife, and a small first aid kit. I left everything else behind. I stepped outside, the early morning air crisp and cold. I kept my eyes on the tree line as I walked quickly toward the dirt road, trying to stay on the path and avoid the hidden trails I had seen. The forest was eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath. After what felt like hours, I reached the road. My car was still where I left it, dust-covered but untouched. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, the cabin disappeared behind me, swallowed up by the forest. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. But the road was empty, and the trees stood still. When I got home, I called the local sheriff's office and told them everything. They sent a deputy to check the cabin. The deputy told me they found signs someone had been living there recently. A small campfire pit nearby, some discarded food wrappers, and worn footprints circling the cabin. They suspected a transient or a hunter had been using the cabin without permission, but they hadn't caught anyone. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. Even now, months later, I think about those nights alone in the forest, the weight of someone watching just beyond the trees, the feeling that at any moment, the silence could have broken with something worse. The experience taught me that the wilderness isn't just about nature. Sometimes, It's about the people you don't see and the dangers that come from being completely alone in a place where help is miles away. It was real, it was terrifying, and it was something I wouldn't wish on anyone. I didn't expect that weekend to turn into one of the worst experiences of my life. I had been looking forward to it for months. Just me, a small cabin in the woods, and some time away from everything. No internet, no phone signal, just the quiet and the outdoors. I wanted to clear my head. I wanted to get away. I found the cabin through a small rental site, tucked away deep in a forest that stretched for miles. The pictures showed a simple one-room wooden cabin, a little weathered but sturdy, with a porch and a wood stove. It was isolated, perfect. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road leading in was little more than a dirt track. The idea of being that alone was exactly why I booked it. The drive there was long and winding, with tall trees crowding the narrow road, their branches brushing the roof of my car. As I got closer, the forest grew thicker. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, the kind that feels like the world has stopped. I pulled up in front of the cabin, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment just listening. No cars, no people, no sounds but the wind through the trees. I stepped out, stretched, and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and must. Dust motes floated in the beams of fading light through the window. The cabin was small, with a single room that had a wooden floor, a small bed in the corner, a rough wooden table, and a wood stove against the wall. A few shelves held old books and some canned goods left by the owner. The windows had thin curtains that fluttered softly in the breeze coming through a cracked window. I unpacked my bag, laid out some clothes, and set a few things on the table: my flashlight, a map, some snacks. The plan was simple: spend the night here, go for a hike the next day, then come back and spend another night before driving back to town. As night settled, I chopped some wood and started a fire in the stove. The small room quickly warmed, the light flickering off the walls. I ate a quick dinner, sat back in the creaky old chair, and tried to relax. At first, nothing felt wrong. The sounds of the forest at night were peaceful. The rustle of leaves, the call of distant owls, the soft whistle of wind through the trees. But as the hours passed, I started to notice something else. A low sound, barely there, coming from outside. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind or animals. It was a quiet, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps, but heavier and slower. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe a branch knocking against the cabin. I even got up to check the perimeter, flashlight in hand, but found nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no movement in the shadows. That first night, I finally fell asleep, but the thumping continued. Sometimes it got louder, then softer. It was steady enough to keep me from feeling completely safe, but not loud enough to be certain there was something out there. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. I packed some water, my phone, though I didn't expect signal, and a small first aid kit. The trail was overgrown and muddy from recent rain, but the forest was beautiful, with thick trees and moss-covered rocks. I walked for hours, enjoying the solitude and the sound of birds. As I walked back, the sun was dipping again. The woods felt different, darker, colder. The shadows grew longer. I hurried to get back before nightfall. When I got close to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The small firewood pile I had built the night before was scattered, logs knocked over. The door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. A chill ran down my spine. I froze for a moment, listening. The forest was silent. No animals, no footsteps. I pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. Nothing seemed stolen or missing, but something felt off, like I wasn't alone. I spent the evening making sure the cabin was locked tight. I moved furniture in front of the door, even though I knew it wouldn't stop a determined person. I kept my phone nearby, but there was no signal. The thumping sound was back, louder now, and sometimes accompanied by a faint scratching on the cabin walls. I stayed up all night, my eyes flicking between the dark windows and the shadows outside. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was miles away and the dirt road was rough. I didn't want to risk a night walk through the forest. On the third day, I decided to check the area around the cabin more thoroughly in daylight. I wanted to see if there were any signs of people, footprints, campsites, anything. The forest floor was damp and soft. Near the edge of the trees, I found fresh footprints, human. They weren't deep, so whoever made them wasn't heavy or wearing boots, but they were there, coming close to the cabin and going back into the woods. I took pictures with my phone and felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I wasn't alone. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. I thought back to the sounds at night, the door left open, the scattered wood. This wasn't the wilderness being wild. This was someone messing with me, testing me, maybe waiting. That night, I set traps around the cabin. Nothing fancy, just some noise traps using cans and strings. I set up a makeshift alarm on the door with a piece of wire that would clang if moved. I stayed awake all night, clutching a heavy stick, ready for whatever might come. Around midnight, the noise started again. The thumping, the scratching. Then the wire on the door clanged sharply. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood up, eyes darting, breath shallow. Suddenly, the door handle moved. Slowly, someone was trying to open it. I raised the stick, ready to swing, but the handle stopped. The door didn't open. The thumping slowed, then stopped altogether. I waited in tense silence for what felt like an eternity. Then, I heard footsteps retreating into the dark woods. Faint, careful, and fading. I didn't sleep after that. Dawn felt like salvation. In the morning, I called the local sheriff's office from the nearest town, explaining what had happened. They told me they would send someone to check the cabin and patrol the area. They warned me not to stay there alone and to find a safer place until help arrived. When the deputy came a few hours later, he was serious but calm. He searched the area, found more footprints, and said it looked like someone had been living rough nearby, maybe squatting or hiding. They hadn't found any serious threat or criminal record for the area, but they said it could be someone desperate or dangerous, watching the cabin for days. They promised to keep an eye on the place and patrol more often. I packed my things and left the cabin that afternoon, my hands still shaking, my heart heavy with the memory of those nights. The forest looked calm and beautiful again in the daylight, but I knew what lurked in the dark. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror at the tall trees, feeling a chill I couldn't shake. I realized how easily someone could disappear into those woods and how alone I really was out there. The whole experience taught me to never underestimate the people who live on the edge of the world, the ones who hide and watch, the ones who don't need ghosts or monsters to scare you, just the silence and the darkness and the feeling of being hunted. I never went back to that cabin. I never wanted to feel that helpless again. It had been a long drive, the kind that wears on you the longer you sit in a car without much else to focus on. I was headed deep into the mountains, where cell signal vanished and the roads became little more than dirt tracks winding through dense trees. The plan was simple: spend a few days alone in a small cabin I'd rented. Just me, the woods, and some quiet time away from everything. I didn't expect anything unusual. I wanted a break from the city's noise, the endless emails, the crowded streets, the constant hum of everything moving too fast. I just wanted to sit somewhere still and breathe. The cabin was a modest structure, built mostly of weathered logs, with a rusty tin roof and a porch that creaked underfoot. It sat a little off the main dirt road, surrounded by towering pine and fir trees that seemed to reach for the sky like fingers. Around it, the ground was thick with pine needles and fallen branches, and a small creek ran nearby. The place smelled sharp and fresh, with smoke from the chimney, the earth, and the faint scent of damp moss. The first thing I did was open the windows to let in the cool mountain air. It was the kind of clean, biting air that wakes your lungs up, the opposite of the city's stale smog. I brought in the bare essentials: some food, water, a couple of books, a flashlight, matches, and a small camping stove. The cabin had an old wood stove inside, but the last renters must have left it dirty, and it smelled like burnt ash mixed with something sour. There was no electricity or running water, which I expected, so I filled a few jugs with water from the tap outside and stocked the small pantry with canned beans, instant coffee, dried meat, and crackers. It wasn't a luxury stay, but that was the point. The first night was peaceful. After a quick meal heated on the stove, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and watched the sun sink below the ridge. The forest was quiet except for the usual night sounds. Distant hoots from owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the soft rush of the creek. I felt a little on edge, like I was being watched, but I knew that was normal when you're alone somewhere unfamiliar. The forest feels alive in a way cities don't. I slept on a small cot in the main room. The walls were thin, and I could hear the wind whistle between the logs. It made a steady, mournful sound that I imagined was the mountain's own breathing. I woke a few times to that, but I didn't mind. It was different, but not unpleasant. On the second day, I decided to explore the nearby woods. I packed a small backpack with water, a pocket knife, and my flashlight, just in case. The forest floor was thick with needles and dry leaves that crunched underfoot. The trees were older here, taller and closer together, casting deep shadows even at midday. I walked along the creek for a while, the water clear and cold, moving over smooth stones. I found some old, rusted cans and bits of broken glass near the bank, signs someone had been here before, but the area was otherwise untouched. No trails, no footprints besides mine. As I wandered, I noticed the forest getting quieter. The birds stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to die down. The silence pressed in around me, thick and unnatural. That was the first time I felt real unease, a prickling at the back of my neck. I checked my watch. I'd been walking for a couple of hours. Time passed slowly here, as if the forest stretched it out. I decided to turn back. The path back was harder to find than I expected. The woods all looked the same, tall dark trunks stretching up, leaves filtering the sunlight into thin green beams. I tried to follow the creek, but it curved and split in ways that made me lose track. I stopped several times to listen for sounds that could guide me. Running water, birds, but it was all quiet. I started feeling more nervous. The longer I stayed, the more the shadows around me seemed to deepen. After what felt like an hour but might have been less, I found the dirt road again. Relief washed over me. I headed back to the cabin, promising myself I wouldn't wander off again. That night, something was different. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming even though the sky was clear. I was in bed early, wrapped in a thick blanket, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, the soft thud of something moving. Maybe animals, I told myself, deer or raccoons. But the noises didn't follow any pattern I could place. They sounded too deliberate, too close. I got up and went to the window, peering out into the blackness. The porch light didn't work. There was only moonlight filtering through the trees. In the shadows, I thought I saw movement. Something quick, slipping between the trunks. I blinked and it was gone. The hair on my arms stood up, and I swallowed hard. I checked the locks on the doors. The cabin was old, and the doors didn't fit tight. I pushed a heavy chair under the doorknob just to be sure. I tried to tell myself it was just the woods, just the wind playing tricks on me, but my heart was racing. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I packed my things quietly, trying not to think about what I'd heard or seen. The thought of spending another night alone in that cabin made my skin crawl. Before I left, I went outside to check the perimeter. The forest was quiet again, the sun filtering softly through the branches. I noticed tracks near the edge of the clearing, large footprints in the soft dirt, not quite human. They were spread wide with deep impressions, and they led toward the cabin. I followed them around the cabin carefully. The prints circled close to the porch, close enough that whoever or whatever made them had been near the door at some point in the night. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard anyone approach, but maybe I'd been asleep or too scared to notice. I took photos with my phone to show later, then packed everything in the car. I left quickly, eyes constantly scanning the tree line as I drove back down the mountain road. For weeks after, I tried to make sense of what had happened. No one had any idea what the footprints could be. Maybe a large animal, maybe someone living off the grid nearby. But no one I spoke to seemed worried. I felt foolish for being scared, but the feeling stayed with me, the sensation of being watched, hunted even, by something that didn't want me there. Months later, I learned about a man who had been arrested for breaking into cabins in the same mountain range. He was known to hide out in the woods for days, stealing food and supplies. They said he was dangerous, had attacked people before. That explained the footprints, the noises, the sense of something lurking just beyond sight. It hit me then that my fear hadn't been imagined. I had been close to someone who could have hurt me. Looking back, the experience taught me how thin the line is between safety and danger when you step away from the world you know. The forest isn't just trees and animals. It can be home to people you don't see until it's too late. That cabin, the silence, the cold air. It all felt peaceful until you realize the real threat isn't from the dark or the wild, but from the people who hide inside it. I never went back to that cabin. Instead, I stick to places where help isn't far away, where I can hear the city noise if I need to. Because out there, in the quiet, the real horror isn't ghosts or monsters. It's the feeling that something is watching, waiting, and that you might not be alone after all. That trip stayed with me for a long time. It changed how I look at quiet places and how much I trust the world beyond the safe edges of my daily life. And I keep a little extra caution in my step whenever I find myself somewhere too still, too dark, where you can't hear anything except your own breathing and footsteps. Because sometimes, that's the scariest sound of all. The woods were thick and silent when I first arrived at the cabin. It was late September, the kind of cold that creeps under your skin, the air crisp but not quite freezing yet. The trees around the cabin stood tall, their branches mostly bare, a few stubborn leaves clinging on like memories. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, hoping to escape the noise of the city, the endless emails, the blaring phones, and the crowds. I wanted peace. What I got was something else entirely. The cabin was small, made of weathered logs darkened by years of rain and sun. It sat alone in a small clearing, surrounded by nothing but forest. No neighbors for miles, no roads, just the narrow dirt track I'd taken to get here. It had an old metal roof that jingled whenever the wind blew and a tiny porch with a rusty railing. The front door was heavy, with peeling paint and a crooked handle. I had to shove it hard to get it open. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old wood. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots, and the windows were grimy, letting in only thin streams of fading sunlight. The furniture was sparse and worn. A rickety table, a few mismatched chairs, and a small bed with a thin mattress pushed into the corner. There was a wood stove, cold and silent, and a shelf filled with a few cracked plates and empty cans. A single, bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, though I wasn't sure if the wiring still worked. I had come prepared. I brought enough food for the week, water bottles, a sleeping bag, and a small propane stove. The nearest store was miles away, and the phone had no signal. This was intentional. I wanted to disconnect. No internet, no calls, no distractions. Just me and the forest. The first night passed quietly. I made a fire outside the cabin in a small pit I cleared, the dry wood crackling and throwing warm orange light against the trees. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional snap of twigs. But it was the kind of life I expected, natural and calm. I slept with the windows closed and my backpack near the door. The next day, I spent walking through the forest, taking photos, and writing in my notebook. The air was sharper now, and the wind seemed colder. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds that promised rain. I found a small stream not far from the cabin and filled my water bottles there. The water was clear and tasted fresh, but the dampness in the air made the ground muddy and slippery. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, though I was sure I had locked it tight that morning. My heart jumped, and I quickly shut and locked it again. I checked the windows. None of them were broken or open. There was no sign anyone else had been inside. No footprints around the porch except my own. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. I tried not to let it get to me, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stayed inside, closing the curtains early and sitting close to the wood stove as I cooked dinner on the propane burner. The rain started that night, a steady drumming against the roof that made the cabin feel smaller, more enclosed. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was faint but sharp, like footsteps crunching in the wet leaves outside. I froze, listening hard. The rain was steady, but those footsteps kept coming, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the curtains, shining the beam into the dark forest. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I sat awake for hours, my heart pounding. I didn't hear anything else after a while, but sleep didn't come back easily. When dawn broke, I forced myself to get up, trying to shake off the unease. The third day was worse. I woke early and found something new, small, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the clearing right up to the porch steps. They weren't animal prints, too large and shaped like boots or shoes, but they stopped at the steps. No prints leading away. It was like whoever had been there vanished into thin air. I checked the windows and doors again, tightening all the locks. I grabbed the old hunting knife I found in the cabin's kitchen drawer and kept it close. I didn't want to imagine who could have been there, but my mind wandered to the worst possibilities. That day, I tried to keep busy, chopping firewood to keep the stove going and fixing a loose floorboard near the entrance. But every little sound made me jump. A twig snapping underfoot, a bird taking flight, the wind pushing branches against the cabin walls. Late in the afternoon, I heard a soft knocking at the door. I froze. I waited. Nothing. I didn't open it. Instead, I looked through the peephole. A small round hole in the door covered by a sliding metal cover. There was no one there. The knocking came again, softer this time, like someone tapping with their fingers. I stood back and listened, my breath caught in my throat. Then it stopped. I sat down against the wall and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was some kid playing a prank from a nearby farm, or maybe just the branches hitting the door. But I knew no farms were nearby, at least not for miles. The night was the hardest. Couldn't sleep. Every noise outside made me tense. I kept the knife on my lap, the flashlight on the floor beside me. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Morning came with a heavy fog that blanketed the clearing. I didn't want to stay another night. I packed up most of my things and planned to leave as soon as the fog lifted. But then, I noticed something else. Something carved into the wooden door frame. It was faint but unmistakable. A rough symbol scratched deep into the wood. I didn't recognize it. It looked like two intersecting lines with jagged edges, like someone had taken a knife and made a quick mark. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the rough splinters. Chilled me. Whoever had been here wanted me to see that. I took pictures and texted them to a friend back home, asking if they knew what it meant. No answer. My phone was still dead for signal. That afternoon, the fog finally lifted, and I decided to hike out. I couldn't wait another night in that cabin with the feeling that someone or something was out there watching. As I packed the last of my gear, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, heavier this time, moving fast through the underbrush. I stopped and listened. The steps were closer now, crunching the dead leaves, moving directly toward the cabin. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, ready to face whatever was coming. The steps stopped outside the door. I could hear breathing, heavy and ragged. I held my breath, my hand shaking on the door handle. Then, a loud bang. Someone hit the door hard, again and again. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open and swung the flashlight beam into the clearing. No one, just the forest, quiet and still. The banging stopped. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. On the ground, a small black bag, torn open, with some food and a flashlight inside. I bent down, heart still racing, and picked it up. Inside was a note folded tight. I opened it carefully. It said, "You shouldn't be here." I looked around again, but no one was there. I realized then that someone had been watching me all along. Maybe for days. They had been following me through the woods, leaving signs and warnings. They didn't want me there. I didn't stay another second. I ran down the dirt track, heart pounding, not stopping until I reached my car miles away. I locked the doors and drove as fast as I could back toward the city. When I finally looked in the rearview mirror, the trees seemed to close behind me, the cabin lost somewhere in that vast, dark forest. I never went back. The cabin still sits there, quiet and empty, but I know someone watches it, waiting for the next person foolish enough to stay. The forest is full of secrets, but not the kind you want to find. I didn't plan on it being scary. Honestly, I was just looking for some peace and quiet. I had been working nonstop for months, stuck in the city's noise and stress, and something about the idea of getting away, even for a few days, felt like a lifeline. So I rented a small cabin out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods of northern Maine. The kind of place where your phone barely gets a signal and the nearest neighbor is miles away. The cabin was an old wooden thing, nothing fancy, but it had a stove, a small fridge, and a wood pile stacked next to the porch. I drove in late afternoon, down a narrow dirt road that got rougher and narrower as I went, until it ended at the cabin's driveway, a thin clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The sun was dipping low, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was dim but cozy. A single room with a small kitchen, a table, and a wood-burning stove against the far wall. There was a small bed in the corner, a worn couch, and a few shelves with some books and old maps. The windows were thick and had a few cracks in the frames, but nothing broken. There was an old oil lantern on the table and a box of matches by it. After unloading my bag, I went outside to gather some wood. The stack looked decent, but I wanted to make sure I could keep the fire going all night. The forest around the cabin was thick, mostly pines with some birch and maple mixed in. The ground was covered in dry needles, leaves, and pine cones. I gathered a bundle, enough for a few hours, and stacked it next to the door. The sun was gone by then, and the sky turned a dark blue with a handful of stars starting to peek through the trees. I lit the stove, feeling the heat and the crackling of the fire fill the cabin. It was comforting. I had some canned soup and a few crackers for dinner. I sat by the stove, watching the flames, feeling the quiet settle in around me. That first night was calm. The usual forest sounds, owls hooting, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch, felt peaceful. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard something that didn't fit. At first, it was a low rustling outside, just beyond the porch. I thought maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't move away like it usually does. Instead, it stayed, a slow, dragging noise mixed with the occasional sharp snap of a twig. It was faint but steady, like someone or something was walking carefully, but with purpose, just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal or the wind. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows. They were old but sturdy enough. The cabin sat alone, miles from the nearest house, so whoever or whatever was out there couldn't be someone just wandering by accident. The sound stopped after maybe 15 minutes, but my heart was racing. I stayed up for a while longer, staring into the dark corners of the cabin, but eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin more. The woods were dense, with narrow paths made by animals or people long gone. I noticed some broken branches and disturbed leaves near the edge of the clearing, like something large had been there recently. It didn't feel right. I tried to call someone on my phone, but there was no signal. No surprise there, but the isolation hit me harder when I realized I couldn't easily reach out for help or even let anyone know where I was. I made a mental note to stay alert. That evening, as the sun set, I kept a fire going in the stove and sat by the window. I wanted to see if anything unusual happened again. The woods grew darker and quieter as night came, the shadows stretching like thick blankets over the ground. Then I heard it again, the slow, dragging noise outside, like someone walking carefully but deliberately through the underbrush. This time it was closer, right outside the cabin, near the porch. I didn't move, hoping it was just my imagination, but the sound was real. Something was out there. I grabbed my old hunting knife from my bag and held it close, ready just in case. My breath was shallow, and my eyes darted around the dark window. I couldn't see anything, but I heard faint footsteps circling the cabin, the noise of leaves crunching under heavy boots. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might give me away. I didn't want to shout or make noise. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and everything went quiet. I waited, frozen, for what felt like forever. Then, after some minutes, the footsteps moved away slowly, fading into the night. I stayed up the rest of the night, fire burning low but steady, knife in hand, listening to every sound. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted but somewhat relieved. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay much longer. Whatever was out there was watching, and it made me uneasy. But I was stubborn, and I wanted to get one last night of quiet. I checked the cabin carefully, looking for signs of forced entry or footprints, but found nothing obvious. Still, the broken branches and disturbed earth near the clearing stayed in my mind. That night, the dragging noise came again, but it wasn't alone. There were heavy breathing sounds, maybe even soft growls or grunts. The footsteps were heavier this time, and louder. I realized that it wasn't an animal. It was something else. I locked the door, closed the windows, and pulled the curtains tight. I sat in the dark, listening to the sounds outside, the heavy steps circling, stopping, then moving on. I thought about packing and leaving, but the road was dark, and I didn't want to risk running into whoever or whatever was stalking around. Hours passed, and eventually the sounds faded away. I didn't sleep much that night. At dawn, I stepped outside with a flashlight. The ground around the cabin was disturbed more than before. There were footprints, large and heavy, pressed deep into the soft dirt and pine needles. They were too big to be a normal person's boots, and the stride was long, almost like someone was moving fast or carrying a heavy load. I followed the tracks a little ways into the woods. They led to an old, overgrown trail that disappeared into the thick forest. I wanted to follow them further but stopped. I had no idea what was out there, and the trail looked like it hadn't been used in years. That day, I decided I needed to leave before it got dark again. I packed quickly, stacking wood and clearing the cabin, then locked up tightly. As I started down the narrow dirt road, I noticed something that froze me in place. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree, was a large pile of wood and sticks arranged in a rough pyramid shape. It looked like a crude shelter or a hunting blind, and it hadn't been there before. My heart raced. Whoever was out there had been watching me, maybe even living near the cabin. That wasn't just some random stranger or animal. It was someone who knew this forest well and wanted to stay hidden. I hurried to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped away, the tires throwing up dirt and gravel on the road. When I got to a town a couple hours away, I called the local sheriff's office and reported what I saw. They told me the area was known for illegal hunting and trespassing, sometimes by dangerous people who used the woods to hide from the law. They said it was best not to go back there alone and that they would send a patrol to check the area. It was the last time I stayed in a cabin alone in the woods. ####. What I learned from that trip was how easily you can feel safe in nature one moment, and how fast that safety can slip away when you realize you're not alone. It's not ghosts or monsters. It's real people who can be dangerous and know how to move unseen in the wild. The cabin was just a quiet place on the surface, but the woods around it hid something darker. Someone using the forest for their own reasons. Someone who didn't want to be found but was watching every move I made. I don't think they meant to hurt me that night. Maybe they were just cautious, or maybe they were testing if I was a threat. But whatever it was real, and it made me feel small and vulnerable in a way no scary story could. Now, whenever I think about going back to the woods, I remember the footsteps circling the cabin, the heavy breaths in the dark, and that pile of sticks. A silent warning that I was never truly alone, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see. It was late September when I decided to take a break from the city. Work had been relentless for months, and I needed a place far from the noise, the people, the constant buzz of screens and sirens. I found a small cabin to rent through a local listing website, a modest, weathered structure nestled deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. The photos showed peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a thick forest of pines and maples surrounding it. The listing said it was off-grid with no internet or cell service, but that was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and silence. I arrived just before dusk on a Friday, driving a long gravel road that twisted through dense forest. The cabin sat at the end of the road, isolated and quiet. When I stepped out of my car, the air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest felt heavy, almost like it was watching, but I shrugged it off. That was just the way old woods felt to city folks like me. The cabin's door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dim but tidy. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a dining table, and a few mismatched chairs. A couch covered in a threadbare blanket. A narrow staircase led to a loft with a bed. There was a pile of firewood stacked near the stove and a box of kindling on the floor. No electricity, just a few lanterns and candles left behind by the owner. I unpacked my bags quickly. I brought food that didn't need refrigeration. Canned beans, bread, peanut butter, some dried fruit, and a small cooler with water bottles. No fresh produce, no fancy meals. I figured I'd eat simply while I was there. After a quick walk around the outside to get my bearings, I lit the fire stove. It took some patience, but soon the fire was crackling, filling the room with warmth and light. I made a cup of instant coffee on the stove and sat down to watch the flames. Outside, the forest was dark now, the canopy blocking out what little moonlight there was. The first night was quiet, except for the sounds of the forest. Branches snapping in the wind, distant birds calling, maybe an owl hooting. I felt peaceful in a way I hadn't in months. The next morning, I woke early to sunlight filtering through the small window. I brewed another cup of coffee and decided to explore the area around the cabin. The listing said the nearest road was over a mile back, so I figured I was pretty deep in the woods. I walked for nearly an hour, moving carefully through the undergrowth. The forest was dense but not impassable. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. I noticed the occasional deer tracks and saw a few rabbits darting between the trees. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were my boots crunching and the distant rustle of wind through branches. After wandering, I made my way back to the cabin. That's when I saw something strange near the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. Footprints. They were large boot prints, fresh. The dirt was soft from recent rain, and the prints were deep. They led from the edge of the trees toward the cabin and then stopped abruptly near the porch. I froze for a moment, heart beating faster. I hadn't heard or seen anyone else since I arrived. The prints didn't look like mine, and I knew for sure I hadn't noticed anyone else driving down the road. Maybe the owner came by recently, but the listing said no one lived nearby. No one else was supposed to be around. I checked my phone quickly, hoping for some signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no messages. That was expected, but it felt more isolating now. I decided to stay alert. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The cabin had sturdy wooden locks, but they didn't feel like much if someone really wanted in. I tried to push the thought aside and got a fire going again. The sky was clouding over, and a chill was creeping in. I settled back down with a book, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Later that day, I went outside to chop some firewood. I'd brought an old axe from home for exactly this purpose. The stack of wood by the cabin looked like it had been untouched for a while, so I figured I'd add to it. As I swung the axe, the forest seemed to grow quieter around me. The usual bird calls faded. Even the wind seemed to die down. It was an eerie silence that pressed in on me, thick and unnatural. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the weather was shifting, maybe animals were hiding. By late afternoon, I noticed another strange thing. The firewood I chopped was scattered across the ground near the cabin. It looked like something had knocked it over deliberately. I didn't see any signs of animals. No broken branches or tracks that would suggest a deer or bear had done it. The ground was too soft. I would have seen footprints if something big had passed through. I restacked the wood carefully, feeling my nerves tighten. I kept my phone close, even though it was useless without a signal. That night, I didn't sleep well. The forest noises were louder, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but something else too. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, pacing footsteps that seemed to circle the cabin. I lay awake, holding a flashlight under the blankets, scanning the windows. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and then there was silence. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if someone really was out there. The next morning, I found fresh footprints again. This time they were closer, right at the edge of the porch. I checked for any signs of forced entry, none. The door was locked tight. I stayed inside most of the day, keeping a fire going and trying to ignore the growing unease. I thought about leaving, but I was a good 2 miles from the nearest road, and the forest was thick. I didn't have a map or GPS, and I wasn't sure how long it would take to hike back with my gear. On the third night, I heard something different. Not footsteps, but voices. Low, muffled, coming from the woods. I strained to listen, but they were indistinct. No clear words. The voices stopped after a few minutes, replaced by the usual forest sounds. I wanted to believe it was just hunters or hikers passing through, but I hadn't seen any vehicles or people on the road. The voices were too close, though, maybe just outside the tree line. The next morning, I found more signs. Small bits of trash, empty snack wrappers, a plastic bottle, left near the edge of the clearing. Whoever was here wasn't just passing through. They had been watching or waiting. I started to prepare more seriously. I gathered all the firewood into one big pile, ready to burn if I needed to. I made sure my knife and axe were close by. I rationed my food and water, figuring I might need to leave suddenly or defend myself. The isolation was crushing. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I tried to keep busy, fixing the cabin's broken window latch, stacking wood, keeping the fire burning. But the tension never left. By the fourth night, I knew I wasn't alone. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate. I saw shadows moving just beyond the window's edge. The voices whispered in the distance, sometimes close, sometimes fading into silence. At one point, I spotted a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the firelight. They didn't move or make noise, just watched. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the figure. It disappeared instantly, melting into the trees. I couldn't see where they went. Fear was no longer just in my mind. It was real and pressing, like the forest itself was closing in. I spent the next day planning my escape. I decided I would leave at first light, take only my backpack and essentials, and hike back down the road. I knew it would be hard, but staying another night was too dangerous. That evening, I barely slept. The footsteps were relentless, circling the cabin all night. At one point, I heard the sound of a rock hitting the window pane. I jumped up, grabbed my axe, and waited in the dark for what felt like hours. When dawn finally broke, I packed quickly and checked the cabin one last time. The footprints around the cabin were fresh again, more numerous than before. Whoever was out there had been here all night. I stepped out carefully, keeping my eyes on the forest line as I moved toward the road. The hike back was exhausting. The forest was thick, and I had to push through branches and underbrush. My legs were scratched and sore by the time I reached the gravel road. When I finally saw the highway in the distance, relief flooded through me. I walked along the road until I found a gas station and a payphone, where I called the local sheriff's office. I told them about the cabin, the footprints, the voices, and the feeling that someone had been watching me all along. The sheriff said they would send someone to check the place out. 2 days later, I got a call back. They'd found signs of people living illegally in the woods near the cabin, makeshift campsites, stolen supplies, and evidence of drug use. The area had been a hotspot for people hiding from the law, using the dense forest for cover. The sheriff warned me to never go back alone. That night, lying in my apartment bed with the city noises humming faintly outside my window, I realized how close I'd come to plan was simple enough. I needed a break from the city, from the noise, the traffic, the endless meetings and phone calls. I had booked a cabin deep in the woods for a week. Just me, the forest, and some quiet. The cabin was about 100 miles from the nearest town, somewhere in the northern part of the state. I chose it because it looked remote, isolated, far from any real distractions. No cell service, no internet, just me and the trees. I packed lightly. Some clothes, a few canned foods, water, a lantern, a good old-fashioned flashlight, and a hunting knife my grandfather gave me years ago. No fancy gear, no GPS, just the basics. The idea was to disconnect completely. The drive up was long but beautiful. The highway narrowed as I left the main road and turned onto a dirt track, the trees closing in around me. Tall pines, thick bushes, the kind of forest where you wouldn't want to get lost. I kept the windows rolled down, breathing in the sharp, clean air. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as it did in the pictures. A small wooden structure, weathered but solid. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. No neighbors in sight, no roads other than the one I came in on. The roof was rusty but intact. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Inside was simple. A single room with a wood stove, a small table and chair, a bed pushed against the wall, and a few shelves with old books and cans of food. There was a little kitchen corner with a sink and a counter, but no running water. I brought my own water in jugs. The place smelled like old wood and damp earth, but it felt solid, safe. The first night passed quietly enough. I built a small fire in the stove, cooked some canned beans, and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. Crickets chirping, a distant owl hooting now and then. I felt good, peaceful even. The next day, I set about exploring. I walked a few trails, careful to mark my path. The forest was thick, green, and alive. The sun filtered through the branches in golden shafts. I saw a few deer tracks, some bird nests, and even a squirrel darting through the underbrush. It was beautiful. I felt like I'd stepped back in time. That evening, I went to bed early. The night was quiet at first. Then, around midnight, I woke up. Something wasn't right. I could hear a faint rustling outside, like branches snapping. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or a fox maybe. I stayed still, listening, but the noise came again, closer this time. It wasn't normal animal sounds. It was heavier, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully opened the cabin door, peeking out into the darkness. The moon was full, lighting the clearing, but I saw nothing at first. Then I noticed footprints in the dirt just outside the porch. They were large, too large for any deer or dog. Human prints. That made my heart skip a beat. I scanned the woods with the flashlight beam but saw no one. I called out, but my voice sounded weak in the open air. No answer. I locked the door and slid the bolt tight. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The rest of the night, I stayed awake, listening for any other sounds. The rustling returned, faint and distant. I told myself it was probably just a bear or some other wild animal. But the thought of someone else out there, watching, made my skin crawl. The next day, I found more footprints around the cabin. They weren't fresh, maybe a day or two old, but they were definitely there. I followed them a bit into the woods but lost them quickly. Whoever they belonged to knew how to stay hidden. I checked my supplies. My water jug had been moved a few feet from where I left it. Nothing else was taken, but it was enough to unsettle me. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was a hunter or a camper passing through. The area was remote, but not completely inaccessible. Still, the thought of someone sneaking around without telling me made me wary. That night, I kept the fire burning in the stove and set the flashlight by my bed. Every time I heard a noise, I gripped my knife and sat up. Around 3 a.m., I heard something worse. Footsteps on the porch. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped outside the door, then slowly moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things. I decided to leave. This wasn't the quiet retreat I'd hoped for. I started the car, but it wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I tried again and again. No luck. I felt trapped. I checked the car carefully. No signs of tampering, but the battery was completely dead, and I had no way to jumpstart it. My phone had no signal. I realized whoever had been out there must have done this. Panic settled in. I went back inside the cabin, locking every door and window. I gathered some firewood, sharpened my knife, and kept the flashlight close. The day passed slowly. I stayed near the stove, watching the woods outside. I tried to think through my options. Night fell, and the feeling of being watched returned. Couldn't shake it. I kept hearing soft footsteps around the cabin, sometimes on the roof, sometimes on the porch. I stayed silent, breathing quietly. At one point, I caught a glimpse of someone moving between the trees. They were wearing dark clothes, blending into the night. I wasn't sure what they wanted. I didn't want to find out. I stayed awake all night, ready to defend myself. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. I needed to find help. I remembered a small ranger station about 4 miles down the road from where I'd turned off the highway. I had no idea what condition the trail would be in, but I had no choice. I packed a bag with some food, water, my knife, and flashlight. I left the cabin carefully, locked up, and started walking. The forest was thick and the trail was rough. After an hour, I realized I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps behind me, soft, slow. I stopped, turned, and shone my flashlight back. No one. I kept moving, but every now and then I'd hear the footsteps again, following me at a distance. The sun was starting to set as I finally reached the ranger station. It was a small wooden building, closed up for the season, but there was a phone outside. I picked it up and called 911. Within an hour, 2 deputies arrived, guns drawn, and began searching the area. I told them what happened, about the footprints, the car battery, the footsteps on the roof. They listened carefully and said they'd find whoever was out there. Over the next few days, I stayed at the station. They found some campfires and makeshift shelters in the woods nearby. The footprints matched those of a man wanted in the area for burglary and assault. Apparently, he had been hiding in the woods for weeks, targeting remote cabins and hunters. I was lucky to get out when I did. They fixed my car battery, and I finally drove home, feeling shaken but safe. Looking back, I realized how easily things could have gone wrong. The isolation I sought turned into a nightmare. The woods were beautiful but also dangerous, not because of monsters or ghosts, but because people with bad intentions can be even scarier. I learned to never underestimate how vulnerable you are when you're alone, deep in the forest. Now, whenever I think about that trip, I remember the silence broken by footsteps in the dark, the feeling of eyes watching me, and the relief of finally escaping. It was a real kind of fear, one grounded in the world we live in. And sometimes that's the worst kind of all. The cabin was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, nothing more than a small wooden structure tucked away deep in the woods, far from any real sign of civilization. I wanted to escape the noise of the city and the pressure of work. I had heard about this place through an old camping blog, some guy who swore by the peace and quiet it offered. The cabin was owned by a family friend of a friend, so I didn't have to worry about permission or paying a lot of money. It was rustic, basic, and remote, the kind of place that promised silence, fresh air, and no distractions. I didn't expect what happened there to turn my weekend into something I still think about sometimes, months later, and probably will for years. I didn't expect to feel that kind of fear, or to see how quickly things could go wrong when you're all alone, out in the middle of nowhere, with just the walls of an old cabin between you and the vast unknown. The drive out was long but straightforward. The further I got from the city, the quieter everything became. The roads narrowed from 2 lanes down to 1, then to gravel, and eventually just dirt. Trees pressed close on either side, tall pines and oaks stretching up to the sky. The sunlight dappled through the branches, creating shifting patches of gold on the ground as I drove. There wasn't another car in sight. No houses, no signs, nothing but forest. I had packed only the essentials: a small backpack with food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, some basic tools, and a sleeping bag. My phone's signal disappeared miles before I got to the cabin, but I didn't mind. I wanted to disconnect completely. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Small, made of dark, weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a tin roof. A narrow dirt path led up to the porch, which creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The air smelled like pine and old wood, a bit damp but not unpleasant. The cabin wasn't fancy. Inside there was a small wood stove, a metal sink, a table, and 2 simple beds with thin mattresses. The windows were covered with thick curtains, mostly to keep out the cold. Outside, the forest stretched in every direction. I set down my bags and took a deep breath. For a moment, I felt peaceful. This was exactly what I wanted. A chance to be alone, to rest, to escape. That first evening, I chopped some firewood from a pile near the cabin and built a small fire in the stove. The flames crackled and the warmth spread quickly through the room. I cooked some canned beans on the stove, ate slowly, and then sat by the window watching the fading light outside. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant bird call. As night fell, I closed the curtains, locked the door, and tried to settle in for sleep. The cabin felt safe, solid, and quiet. But I noticed something odd. There was a faint scratching sound coming from outside, like nails dragging on wood or stones being shifted. I told myself it was probably just the wind or some animal moving around. Nothing unusual for the woods. The scratching stopped after a few minutes. I shut my eyes and drifted off. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a loud banging on the door. It was sudden and sharp, like someone pounding with their fist. My heart jumped, and I sat up in bed, frozen. The sound came again, 3 quick hits, hard and angry. I stared at the door, too scared to move, trying to listen. The cabin was otherwise silent. No voices, no footsteps, no other noises. The banging stopped. I didn't open the door. I wasn't sure what I'd find outside, and I didn't want to take any risks. I waited, breath shallow, every nerve tense. After a few minutes, the silence returned. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the door. When dawn came, I finally forced myself to get up and check outside. The porch was empty. No sign of anyone. No footprints in the dirt. No broken branches or anything that looked out of place. But I did notice that some of the firewood I had stacked near the door was scattered, like someone had kicked at the pile or tossed logs around. The ground was soft from recent rain, but there were no clear footprints or tire tracks. It was like whoever had been there tried to be careful. I locked the door again and decided to spend the day inside the cabin. I didn't want to go out alone until I figured out what was going on. That afternoon, I stayed near the window and kept an eye outside. The forest seemed calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees swayed in the breeze, and the shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower. I had no phone signal and no way to call for help if I needed it. I started to hear more noises outside. Twigs snapping, soft footsteps, a low rustling in the bushes. Sometimes, a shadow would pass just beyond the treeline. I never saw anyone clearly, but the sounds were close enough to make me nervous. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon or some other wild animal, but some part of me knew it was something else. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat with the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. I listened to the sounds outside. The occasional scratching, the faint crunch of leaves, and the occasional sharp snap of a broken branch. Suddenly, I heard something at the window, a slow, deliberate tapping, like fingers drumming. I froze and stared at the curtain, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped after a few seconds. I didn't look outside. I didn't want to know. The next morning, I woke early and decided to pack up and leave. I didn't want to stay another night in the cabin, not after what had happened. But when I stepped outside to start my car, I realized it wasn't there. I blinked, confused. My car had been parked next to the cabin when I arrived. I was sure of it. I scanned the clearing. No car. The forest stretched all around me, dense and unbroken. I walked the path I had driven in on. No tire tracks in the dirt. No sign that a car had been here recently. Panic started to rise. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked it again. I spent the day trying to stay calm. I rationed my food and water, made a fire, and kept the curtains drawn. Every sound outside set my nerves on edge. I tried to stay busy cleaning the cabin and checking my supplies. At one point, I heard a loud, metallic clang coming from somewhere nearby. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and carefully stepped outside, scanning the trees. The sun was setting again, and the forest was full of long shadows. I found nothing except a strange metal object lying on the ground near the edge of the clearing. A rusty, broken chain with a padlock still attached. I had no idea where it came from, but it was a clear sign someone had been nearby recently. Someone who didn't want me to leave. That night was worse. The tapping at the window returned, along with heavy footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard a voice whispering, but the words didn't make sense and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I stayed awake all night, clutching my knife and listening for anything unusual. At dawn, I forced myself to go outside again. I checked all around the cabin, looking for any sign of people or tracks. But there was nothing except the usual broken branches and disturbed leaves. The third day, I realized I wasn't going to get out by waiting. Whoever had taken my car was still out there somewhere, watching me, maybe even planning something worse. I decided to hike out on foot, even though I didn't know the way back to the main road. I packed what I could carry and left the cabin quietly, locking the door behind me. The forest was dense, and the trail was barely visible. I followed a faint path I had noticed on my first day, hoping it would lead somewhere. Hours passed. My legs ached, and my water was running low. I kept hearing noises behind me, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But when I looked back, no one was there. As the sun began to set, I saw a faint glow ahead, a small campfire, long cold but still visible in the dusk. I approached carefully and found a circle of stones with ashes inside. Nearby, a crudely made trap lay broken on the ground. It looked like someone had been trying to catch something, or maybe someone. I realized I was not just lost. I was being hunted. The night was freezing cold. I found a small cave nearby and took shelter inside. I was terrified, cold, and hungry, but I had no choice. I had to survive until morning. That night, I heard footsteps outside the cave, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking back and forth, maybe waiting for me to come out. I stayed as quiet as I could, holding my knife, hoping they would leave. Morning came and the footsteps stopped. I crawled out and tried to find my way again, moving cautiously through the trees. After hours of wandering, I finally saw a road in the distance. I ran toward it, waving my arms. Car appeared, and I flagged it down. The driver was a local hunter who recognized the area and called for help. I was taken back to town, safe but shaken. The police found my car abandoned a few miles from the cabin, with signs of forced entry. Later, they searched the forest but never found anyone or any clear explanation for what